Greetings everyone and welcome back to Adventures with Dice. I'm Rob, I'm your host for these videos. And this is the Blight Part 2. So this is my ongoing campaign for Icrpg, and you can find all the previous videos in the playlist for Icrpg. But this is Part 2, so if you want to know what happened up until this point, go back and watch the previous videos in this storyline. Now, I am going to use a little bit different format in this to try to give you guys and gals a better view of the battlefield as my players see it. So, hopefully that works out, doing some pictures up here for you guys. We start out with encounter number 4, and this is the Wilds, Part 2, Agnar Ambush. So, in Agnar Ambush, on the second day of travel, after they bypass the wildfire that they started, the broken woodland trail becomes thick with brambles and briars and rotting plants. There is a low growling sound that they can all hear, and they're not sure where it's coming from, but it seems close. So at this point I gave them a round of actions to take up positions or look around, and all of that took place before the Agnar strikes. So the Agnar has the ability to lay in wait, which is what it does, and it tends to ambush players. Now they look like giant gray-green rocks, which I paint a lot of my rocks to look like that. And so as you can see in the pictures, there are 3 rocks, big rocks, on the battle mat, or the ultimate dungeon board that we're playing on. And the players started out kind of in the center of them. And I didn't know which one was going to be the Agnar, because I like to keep everything random and be surprised myself when we're playing. So I rolled randomly for which one it would be. But I gave them a turn to take up positions, which, oddly enough, they all kind of split up into the area, except for the shadow, the elf, who generally tends to try to find somewhere to hide. He did not, that was Ballin, he did not find anywhere to hide. He just kind of stood out in the open. And the back rock is the one that I ended up rolling to be the Agnar. And Jules, Ballin, and Dolgan were all within range of it, because it looks like a big rock, but then boom, you have this big Agnar monster here that I made that's custom miniature. And it charges and chomps at them. And then I kind of gave the timer for it. A 1d4 timer would then determine whether it took a flying leap or a spin thrash. And whenever the timer went off, I'd roll a d6, and they would either take a flying leap or a spin thrash, which are abilities the Agnar has. The Agnar was the threat, and the treat was the pool of water that you see on the battle mat there. And I foreshadowed this by when the Agnar moved around the table. When he got to up where he could see the big pool of water, he backed away from it, but nobody clued in on that. So they went to attacking and realizing they were not doing a lot of damage to the Agnar, but he was able to do a lot of damage to them. Ballin ended up tying a rope off to a tree and then running between his legs, all Empire Strikes Back style, and trying to tie his legs up so that he would trip, which he did eventually trip, but it took a few rounds for them to work it out. In the meantime, while all this is going on and they're fighting this thing and taking damage, Jules cast Hidden, which is like invisibility, on them. And in this game, you can still attack while you're invisible. It's a D4 rounds for how long it lasts. So Delphi climbs up on a rock, and she starts healing, doing area heal effects on her companions to try to keep them up, because they're taking a lot of damage from this thing. But then they all go invisible, and they end up tripping it. It falls down. Dolgan, the dwarf, ends up in the thing's mouth, and he actually loses a turn because he's sickened by being inside this thing's mouth, because it face plants right down in front of him, and he's right under the mouth when it does that. Ballin, who was just dead set on riding this thing, eventually managed to get on top of it and ride it around for a little while, even after it stood back up. After it stood back up, it kind of wandered around a little bit, and I didn't, the Agnar is a beast. It's not a highly intelligent thinking bad guy, so it's just a creature that's wanting to eat. And after a round of them not attacking it while they were invisible, it kind of looks around, and it just made sense for him to say, okay, screw it. He just wanders off because the food disappeared. He can't find the food anymore. There's no reason for him to stand there and just continuously take damage when he can't find whatever is hitting him. So he ends up wandering off with Ballin riding him, who then makes a stealth and dex check to grab a tree limb and whisk himself off the top of the Agnar as it wanders off into the wilderness. So it was kind of a neat fight. They were definitely afraid of the monster that was on the table and weren't sure how to handle it. It's not the most deadly monster that was in the session for the night, but it was definitely the biggest and scariest. So after it wanders off, they're like, okay, well, we're just going to go on about our way. Which, again, just made sense. There was no point in continuing a combat over and over and over that wasn't going anywhere, and the Agnar doesn't realize that they cast some type of magic. All he realized is the food got away. So he goes somewhere else to lay down and wait for more food to come by so that he can try to eat it. Again, it's a big beast. But it was a fun encounter. Man, we had a lot of fun with it. There was a lot of laughs, especially with Ballin really determined to try to ride this thing. So they continued on their journey. That ended that particular... They did find some shabby loot. But that ended that particular encounter. And the next encounter, encounter 5, is the Blighted Abbey. So in this one, I'm just going to put a picture of the room map that I drew up, because I forgot to take pictures of this fight, which didn't really last very long. This is looking down. You can see where the heroes are entering on one side, and they have to get across the abbey and get in the door to the chapel on the other side, because they can tell all of this blight and nastiness is centered on the chapel, and it's coming out from there. So that's where they've got to get, because these monks are obviously in danger, or they've turned. And it's late afternoon when they reach the abbey that leads to the chapel, and right away they get a sense that something is off here. The vegetation here looks blighted, like crops in Oakvale do. The strange green fungus grows wildly across all the plants and up along the stone walls of the abbey. Beyond the abbey is the chapel. The strange moss seems to center there. Nearly the whole building is covered in the stuff. So you can see on the map that I've got 2 points listed as BK. Those are blighted knights that I use some of my Nurgle warriors from Age of Sigmar for. And they're kind of standing guard outside this locked door into the chapel. The players start moving around through the doorways, archways and stuff across the abbey, headed up to the chapel when they encounter one of these guys and then get ambushed by another one. It's a pretty brutal fight really fast. The one that ambushed the dwarf, Dolgan, he runs up and drops Dolgan before he can do anything. The Delphi, the priestess, she's up around the corner here by the plants, and she's constantly having to cast healing to keep the party members up. And the party members are fighting off these guys, and they're eventually whittling them down, but these guys are doing a lot of damage every time they hit, because I'm using the ogre stats without the seismic hammer ability. But I'm using the ogre stats, and the ogre is no joke in Icrpg. It's pretty nasty. So it's a 4-heart creature, and it's got some pretty nasty attacks. So they were getting beat up pretty bad, and she was doing everything she could to keep them up. Like I said, the dwarf dropped so many times this past week that he was a little punch drunk by the end of it. But so I probably should have set my timer at 2 and not rolled it, but I rolled my timer and it came up a 4, so I had to wait 4 rounds for the timer to go off. And when it did, if you notice all the little plant areas around the map, each one was going to spray spores into the air every time the timer went off. And when it went off, the timer would automatically reset, and the spores would cover an area the size of a fireball template, so it's really big. And it only left a very narrow gap right down the center to the door of the chapel that you could be in without getting hit by these spores. Now the spores I used, I didn't poison them or anything. They were just, they would have to make a con check if they were touched by any of these templates when it went off. And if they failed the con check, then they would spend the next round coughing up bile and puking and unable to take any actions. Ballin actually got the worst of this because he happened to be standing between 2 of these things and get hit twice by the spores when they went off. But alas, they did eventually take down the 2 blighted knights and realized they needed to get in a straight line and get close to the door so that they wouldn't get hit by these plants spewing these blighted spores in the air anymore. The plant that one of the treats too, the plants taking any type of fire damage would die immediately, but they did not use fire on any of the plants. They just figured out the area the plants were becoming a danger to, and just avoided that area. So they get up to the door and they send Ballin back to check the bodies of the knights for the keys instead of bashing the door in, which neither one of those knights had the keys. The door was locked from the inside. So then they go to bashing the door down, which only had 1 heart of effort, and they take the door down, and that opens up the blighted chapel. So here is the blighted chapel in these pictures, which inside there are a few things going on. The chapel door, well, I had written the chapel door is heavy and creaks loudly, but you know, it was burst open with a big mace, so it kind of made a lot of noise when it exploded open. There's firelight from the pit in the center of the room that flickers, casting dancing shadows all about. There is a vile green haze in the air of the chapel. Now, this was the nasty, really nasty threat, because there was a con check each turn that you were in the room or you were coughing up bile and losing your actions for the turn. The haze was emitting from the green orb at the back of the room that the Blight Witch was operating, and there was some piping from the green orb over to a well in the chapel that obviously ties into the local waterbed, and it was pumping this bile stuff into the waterbed. So after the heroes pretty much all failing con checks on their first turn and losing a turn on the second turn, Ballin got out of there. He backed out the door, and I'm like, okay, well, if you're outside the door, you don't have to make the con check. So he starts shooting into the room. He first starts targeting the piping going into the well, and he makes some incredible rolls and ends up destroying that. And then he starts, they eventually focus on the orb, but it takes a couple of hearts of effort to destroy the orb. Meanwhile, there's another champion Blight Knight in here who I call Old Drippy, who comes around, and he literally, because the mage Jules, the dwarf Dolgan, and the priestess Delphi were all standing there, had lost their turns. They were coughing and puking because of the haze, and Drippy comes over and he just starts one shot, just bam, hitting them for a ton of damage. He drops the mage Jules, then he drops Dolgan again, He's been dropped like 3 or 4 times now. And he almost drops their healer, Delphi, which she was almost dead at that point. In the meantime, he starts getting shot because he's standing in the line of sight of the doorway, and Balin starts firing in there and tearing him up with a lot of damage. There were a lot of hero coins getting used because I tried to emphasize to them before we played this one that you really got to spend those hero cards because I want to keep handing them out constantly. So there was a there was a lot of hero cards being played throughout this. Meanwhile, while this is going on, the Blight Witch, she cast Witch Rot, which created a near range glyph centered on her, and anything within it would take ultimate damage per round. So they stayed back away from the glyph because they could see it glow on the floor. Now, keep in mind too, there are 2 cages in this room, and in each cage I had 5 of the monks who were stripped down, and they were sickly because they've been breathing this bile, and every time the timer would go off, because they'd count down and then reset again, but every time it would go off, one of the monks would die. Now, ultimately, at the end of the day, they only lost 1 monk, so they saved 9 of the monks. So that was pretty good. The treat here was destroying the Blight Orb to clear the haze from the room, which they eventually did, and once it blew up a turn later, the Blight would clear out, and they could breathe normally. So they started doing healing checks and all sorts of stuff to save the monks and save themselves because they had taken a bunch of damage. And they end up, the witch comes out, and I failed like every chance. Like, she had like 3 turns of trying to cast Healing Nova to heal herself, really. But every time I failed it, and one time it was only by 1 point, but she failed, so she never got any healing, and they were able to whittle her down and drop her. And once they dropped her, the immediate threat was over. They spent some time with the monks and helped heal them back, and the monks were able to explain that the witch had come in from somewhere else. She had talked about somebody, but they couldn't remember who she had talked about, but they don't think she was working on her own. She was working for someone else. So that leaves us with the question of who was the Blight Witch working for. And her poison she was pumping into the water table would phase itself out, given a couple of days. And then they also told the players about the nearby river headed downstream, that they could take a skiff off the river, and they could make it back to Oakvale in 1 day instead of 2 days of travel, which is what they ended up doing. They did give, the monks granted the players 2 rolls on the ancient loot table as gifts for saving them, and both rolls ended up being rings. One was a ring that every time you do ultimate damage, you add +3. Or every time you do ultimate effort, you do add +3 to it. And the other one doubles all magic effort. So 2 very amazingly good items. So here we go. We're going back to Oakvale now. They've saved the monks, who they went there to get help with defeating the Blight. The monks had actually fallen to the Blight as well, and the Blight Witch, but they saved the monks, stopped the Blight, and they're headed back to Oakvale. Now, when they get back to Oakvale, things get a little more hairy. Now, remember, some of these players are new, some of them are very experienced, but all of them are new to this system. So what I've been doing is I started out, like the first adventure was very lead them by the nose, very railroaded, like you just go in, you go room to room and do the thing. Excuse me. And then in this one, they had a little more role play at the beginning with the priest, and here at the end, they're going to start making decisions about what they want to do. And I figured the best way to do that was to hit them with a moral dilemma right out the gate. So, upon returning to town, the heroes are confronted by several locals who are kind of panicking, and the priest that sent them on this mission to begin with. And they tell the heroes that Lord Caspius, remember him, he's the leader of the witch hunters that's in town. Him and his men have arrested a young 15-year-old girl named Liliana for witchcraft and have taken her out to the woods east of town to try her and hang her. Caspius claims that will end the Blight. And if he gets to hang her, he will come back and claim that's what ended the Blight, not the heroes, of course. And the heroes are trying to keep everything low-key around Caspius or any of his supporters because they are magic users or have magic users in their group, and they don't want, these witch hunters on their tail. But before they can decide to go help Liliana, who is... most of the locals don't think she's a witch at all. Most of them think she's just a girl who's simple in the head and mutters to herself a lot. However, because she's been taken out, they have the choice of going to help her, or the now screams they hear from the other end of the street at the other end of town, where an enemy from the last game has returned. That's right, the Horn Beast from the Black Ruins has returned, and he is yanking up locals and throwing them in a ragtag caged wagon because he's mad because heroes from this town came and stole his last group of prisoners he had that he was going to eat. So now he's going to get him a big meal and haul it back to his caves. And I made them decide right then and there, what are you going to do? Are you going to go full in and try to stop this big Minotaur beast, the Horn Beast? Are you going to go after the witch hunters in the woods and try to save the girl? Or are you going to split the party and try to take care of both at one time? It's really up to you. Now, I've put these kind of dilemmas in games before, and very easily it can turn into a 2-hour discussion as they go back and forth and back and forth. So what I did in this one to make it a little bit different and to keep it on track, remember this game is always in rounds, always in turns. I said, okay, we're going to go around the table and you have one turn, basically, in conversation to plead your case for which one you want to do. And then at the end of it, you guys will vote based on what you want to do, what you've talked about. And that's the discussion before, because this is all happening really fast. So you need to make a decision and go. So they went around the table. They did each look at the pros and cons of handling each situation and contemplated splitting up. The only player who was hell-bent on going to help Liliana, the girl in the woods, was the priestess Delphi, but she was outvoted by everybody else who wanted to go after the Horn Beast first. And then if they could, they would take care of the witch hunters. And, of course, I told Delphi, I'm like, well, you don't have to do this. You can go off on your own, which she was like, yeah, I'm not going to do that. So she stuck with the party, and that means that the next adventure will be something like the return of the Horn Beast, because they're going to have to deal with him. And then the witch hunters returning, and we'll see how that plays out. However, it is almost December, and we have a couple of game nights that are going to get intermixed with like Christmas Eve and Christmas parties and things like that. So we decided that last night would be our last game until our next free game night, which is the 7th of January. So there won't be any more updates on this particular campaign this month. It'll be after the 7th, probably the 8th of January, before I can put up the next update on this, which is cool on one hand because I have plenty of time to work on it. But on the other hand, it kind of sucks because we're not really going to be playing this game, which I enjoy a lot, until then. But there's so much going on right now that it's fine. I can work on the game and maybe do a one-shot with a couple of the players with some Order of the Silver Shield adventures, which I talk about in another video that's upcoming this week. And anyway, we'll just see how all that goes. I'm going to continue to put these in the playlist, so just look for that if you miss it when it first goes up. And until next time, my friends, good gaming and good luck.